In part 3, we're going to take a look at the material setup for this, which uses a material stacking approach. Blender doesn't really support stacking of materials in an obvious way, so that's what we're going to look at. And this really is also for new users who just want to see scene setup and all the little details involved in organizing and setting up a scene. This basically is the endpoint of the last tutorial, but I have added a camera and I have added lighting since we're not going to focus directly on the lighting, but I'll show you that at the end. So the first thing that we want to do is take the components that we have and organize them, because we are also going to be duplicating this, so we have two of these objects in the scene. I've also imported the toothpaste object itself. So let's go ahead and set up the organization of our two duplicates. One of them is going to have opening flaps and the other isn't. I've also got the tube here, and we'll take a look at integrating that. So the first thing that we need to do is add an empty into the scene that's going to function as an organizational item. Press Shift and S and return the cursor to the world origin. And then with toothpaste, the collection selected, press Shift and A, and we're going to add an empty called the plane axis. Make sure it's just kind of small. I've got it set to 4 inches. Let's come over here and name this. We'll call this packaging 01. And then let's take our 3 primary objects. So it's the package geometry, it's the armature, and then the lattice. Take these, hold the Shift key, and drop them into packaging 01. So there's our first basic grouping. Now let's come into the tube, which contains these 2 objects. Bring up the context menu with it and do an instance to scene. Hold the Shift key and drag that into that. Okay, so now, in fact, that's huge. They make a default size, and they're always just enormous. I'm going to set that to 2 inches. Come over to packaging 01, the empty for that. Bring up the context menu and do a select hierarchy. Do a Shift and D to duplicate this. Press Z and we'll just move it up so we have these 2 duplicates. For the sake of organizational purposes, I want to rename these duplicates. So it's added .001 because they all have to have unique names, but I'd really like to make this a little bit more human readable, so I'm just going to change it to packaging 02, and then we'll just come in and change each of the items to 2. So this will be package 2 armature, and the lattice will be 2. Now, take note, the duplication mechanism is smart. When there are linked items, one item is referencing another. And so if we come over here to package, and then we look down here at our modifiers, we can see that the modifiers have automatically been renamed. And it's the same for the lattice. So you don't have to worry about that. But I just like to name things in a way that makes them sort of human readable. .001 gets really confusing. So the next thing that we need to do is come over and note, if we preview this, they both have the same animation happening, and we don't want this. We only want the top one to have the animation. And you can see I've still got the non-linear editor active, and so we've got an entry for both of those. So we're going to come back to package 01. We've got the package 1 armature, which is in that group. So let's just go ahead and disable the animation for that. And that was easy. So now we only have that top one that is going to be active as far as an animation goes. So let's come down here to package 2, and we can rotate this and sort of pose it in a way that we think will look nice in the scene, and bring it down so it looks like it's kind of sitting on top of that. So that's basically all I did. This is a very simple scene in terms of this kind of setup, and we can preview the camera by coming over to toggle camera. And we'll be able to change the camera and so on downstream, but this is a good default place for it to be. So now we're getting pretty close to being ready to add textures. And since we're not going to be working with animation now, let's go ahead and collapse these animation components so they're not taking up real estate. Let's come back over to the UV editor. We'll select one of our objects. All we need is one. Press the Tab key to go into edit mode. And there we can see the UV layout. So we went through that process in the last tutorial. I also went through the process of showing how to generate a bitmap from this layout that could then be configured to match the physical size of our objects for label generating purposes. So we went through and we just exported that, and then we came over to Photoshop and we opened up the bitmap that it generated. It initially gave us 4096 by 4096 at 72 dpi image, but we wanted it to be reconfigured to 8.5 by 8.5, and then it just said, given the pixels, that would be 482 dpi. Then that gets saved, and then we simply come over into Illustrator and we open it up. You'll have to reset the artboard to match that, but when you do, then it will be 8.5 by 8.5 inches, and it matches. So from here, then all you do is you come in and you generate your artwork that you want to, apply to your object. So let's press the Tab key to leave edit mode, and let's come over to shading, because this is where the bulk of what it is that we're wanting to take care of happens. I've got one of my objects selected, and that'll be good because we already have label and paper applied, which we did in the last tutorial. Right now, we want to kind of focus on what this is. So we're going to talk about how it is that Blender layers things together. If you use other applications like Photoshop or Illustrator, many graphic applications use a layering approach. You could be forgiven for being a new user and coming in here and looking at the material stacks right here and thinking that Blender is doing the same thing it's doing in Photoshop with Photoshop layers and so on. But it's not. These are material slots. What Blender is doing with each of these is saying, I want this material to be assigned to certain polygons in the mesh, and I want this one to be assigned to other parts of the polygon mesh. So all of the polygons are divided between these slots. And once a polygon is assigned to this slot, it can't be part of another slot. So they don't sit on top of each other in a traditional sense. They're just simply polygon assignments. So let's come into paper and just look at this really quick. The paper is really basic. It's going to be just a basic rough diffuse surface. So we don't need to worry about much. It's got an index of refraction of 1.5. And the IOR level I've already set to 0. And what that means is it's not going to have any glossiness. We don't want any glossiness. It's perfectly rough. So that's easy. So the next thing that we do is we come over to this material that's assigned to this slot, this first one here, called label. And this is where we're going to end up setting up the stacking system for the two materials. One being the top diffuse component of the label, and the bottom is going to be the metallic part of the label. But both of those sit within this label slot. Before we go too much further, let's talk about the basics of a diffuse glossy material versus a metallic mode one. This will be some introductory descriptions for people new to Blender and 3D in general. A diffuse material is one where light reflects off the surface and scatters uniformly in all directions. Think of materials like unpolished wood, concrete, or a painted wall with a matte finish. These materials don't have a shiny surface. Instead, they reflect light in a way that makes them look flat and non-reflective. When you set a base color, or add an image texture into the base color, these define the color of this diffuse layer. In Blender, you can add a reflectivity layer on top of the diffuse component to simulate a glossy material. This adds specular highlights and a slight overall reflectivity, giving the surface a glossy appearance. However, most of the light still reflects off the diffuse layer underneath. The principled BSDF shader has a metallic mode slider. When set to 1.0, the material loses its diffuse component and the surface becomes metallic. Both metallic and diffuse modes reflect most of the incoming light if the base color is set to near white. We can represent the reflectance of the two modes in a graph where the horizontal axis is the incidence angle and the vertical axis is the degree of reflectivity. In both cases, most of the light reflects off the diffuse or metallic layer uniformly, which is shown as a simple horizontal line near the top of the chart. Note that metals do exhibit some subtle changes at higher incidence angles, but the overall effect remains quite similar between the two modes. The key difference between these modes is their handling of roughness. The diffuse component of the principled BSDF always has a high degree of roughness. It doesn't change, giving it a matte finish. In contrast, metallic mode allows for a range of roughnesses, from a perfectly polished mirror-like surface all the way to a rough surface that mimics a diffuse appearance. In addition, in metallic mode, the reflections are always tinted, and this tint is determined by the base color. This is a key characteristic of metals. Their reflections are tinted. Note that at glancing angles, metallic reflections often shift to white, but primarily the metal's reflectance retains its tint. With this understanding, we can configure a material system where part of the packaging uses the principled BSDF in diffuse mode with some glossiness, and another part of the label is set to metallic mode with low roughness. This way, the reflections are tinted according to the package design's bitmap elements. So let's jump back over now into Illustrator and where our source art sits. So I designed this in such a way that I've got parts of it that I want to have destined to be a metallic material and the rest of it a diffuse containing material. So let's think about that for a minute. A diffuse containing material is just if you create a principled BSDF, by default, it's going to give you what we call a diffuse-centric material. Most of the light is going to be reflecting off the diffuse component, and there's a bit of glossiness on top of it, but the glossiness is sort of a secondary effect. Most of the light is going to be interacting with the non-glossy diffuse part. So if we were to come back over to Blender and we look at this, where it says base color, when I say the word diffuse, this is what I'm referring to. In this case, though, it's going to have just a little bit of glossiness, which is determined by the index of refraction, so you can just use the default and not even think about it. And we also want to be aware that when we're in this diffuse-centric mode, the roughness value affects the specular glossy layer that sits above the diffuse, whereas when you're in metallic mode, the roughness directly affects the metallic reflectance. Let's go ahead and set up the two principled BSDFs, one destined for metallic and one destined for the diffuse containing. So let's actually remove the color here and we'll go to saturation just so that we don't think that that's doing anything for us. Take this, Shift and D, and we'll just move that up. And the bottom one is going to be metallic, so we'll just go ahead and set that. And the top one will be the diffuse. Now we just need to save the bitmaps from Illustrator. So we've jumped over to Illustrator, and now all we need to do is just export a bitmap. Just as a quick note, for the sake of simplicity, I've actually set this artwork up as RGB. Typically, you would actually be doing it in CMYK, so you would need to convert CMYK then into sRGB for use in Blender, but I'm just simplifying things so my art can be exported directly from Illustrator. So I would just have all my layers on, diffuse and metallic, do an export, and I've got a file already set here. Make sure to use artboard so it gets everything, and then we would save over that. So I've already got it, and then the next thing that we would do is a file for the mask, and we would save that out, and I've already got that saved. So then we just jump back over to Blender and we bring those in. So bottom is metallic. Let's go ahead, do a Shift A and type in image texture. We'll put that right there. Let's just go ahead and add an image texture for the top because we're going to be adding bitmaps to both. Let's go ahead and open up texture, and there we have the box label all. So that's the entire box label. In fact, we can see that right here. Now, I will say that I'm going to do this twice. In fact, I could just come up here and press X, Shift and D, and I can put that up there. For right now, I'm going to do this so that we have this clear sort of differentiation between what I'm trying to show as layers of materials. But since they're the same, we could actually drive one into both. But for now, we'll just duplicate them. So we'll bring this into color for the metallic layer, and we'll bring this into color for the diffuse layer. Now, let's actually make this really clear. If I select both of these nodes, bring up the context menu, we can do a join in frame. And then with that frame selected, I can just rename that, and we'll call this metallic. This way I have this clear visual differentiation between these two layers, which is why I'm duplicating those nodes. So we'll do the same thing here, join in frame, and then we will rename that, and we'll call this diffuse glossy. Let's go ahead and drive these into the material output. Since we have two of these, you can only ever drive one thing into the final material output. So we need to combine these together. Press Shift and A and then type in mix and then find mix shader. Drop that there. It's actually, we want to put this into the bottom. So the metallic goes into the bottom. So we're thinking about this in a stacking order, as if we were kind of doing this in Photoshop with layers, even though it's not exactly doing it, but it gives us a visual representation of this stacking. And then if we come in here and preview this, Blender's actually just going to mix the two modes together, and we're really not going to see anything. So we need to, it's literally like taking one layer in Photoshop and putting it to 50% so you see it mixed to the layer below. So we need to come in and add another image texture. We'll just drop that up here. And we need to come in and find the mask. And the mask is where the heavy lifting goes as far as bringing in fact, let's come in here and take this to non-color, because it's not something that's going to be displayed visibly. It's affecting a node. Okay, so we'll take that and take it into factor, and then you see that changes it. So the next thing that we need to do is come in here and change the roughness values, because currently the roughness values are at their default for both of these. So in order to adjust the roughness, let's actually go into a more proper render mode. I've got a camera that I've already set up, and I've already got lighting that's set up. We need to come down to the world properties, and I want to make sure under surface that we've got the background strength set to 0. If you don't do that, it's going to put a whole bunch of sort of ambient light into the scene, and we don't want that to happen. So let's come over here and click the camera. Now I've got some area lights already in place that I kind of found artistically where I wanted them to be in terms of position and light intensity. We'll look at that in a bit. So now we can just come over here and we can turn on actual rendering. Okay, so we've got an area light that would be sort of casting itself across the surface. Let's zoom in a little bit, pull this down, and it's a little bit too rough. So let's look at the diffuse glossy first. So the roughness is at that default 50%. And remember, it's affecting the specular glossy layer. It's not affecting the lower diffuse layer. So let's take this down. And when I take it all the way down to 0, you can see that area light reflecting on it in a perfectly mirror-like way, and that doesn't look very good. So I think through practice, I'm going to do 0.13. I think that looks good. Okay, so then we come down to the metallic layer, and the metallic layer is affected by the roughness. And so we can see that changing as I pull this value down, and I found that I liked a value of 0.2 for artistically what I kind of liked. That kind of shows you how the roughness kind of changes what it's doing depending on whether you're in metallic or diffuse glossy. Now there is another way that we could set this up. 3D applications have a lot of flexibility. And this first approach was to show you how it was that we could set up something that had a layering type of approach, that you would have layers in Illustrator or layers in Photoshop, and we could do this layers approach. But we could also accomplish the same look and feel by using a single principled BSDF. So let's quickly take a look at that approach. So let's do this. Let's turn off the interactive renderer, and we're going to remove the metallic. Let's remove the mix shader, and we will drive the principled BSDF, the single one that we have left. Let's directly put that into material output. Let's take the mask node and move it over here. We've already got the single color bitmap for the entire thing already plugged in, so that's good. In this case, we take our black and white mask and we drive this into metallic. And since we basically have mostly just black and white, it will tell it which parts to be fully metallic and which parts to be fully diffuse glossy. So we could preview this now, and we could see that it returns something very similar, but it's not exactly the same. The downside of this approach is that we now have the same roughness value as being applied to both the metallic and the diffuse glossy. And if you want to not have that be the case, then you've got to go to a bit of extra work to make that happen. So we've sort of simplified things by allowing us to only have one principled BSDF, but we have offset the complexity to another area. Let's take the mask node and move it down here. And in fact, we can actually come over here and we can just remove that frame. It's no longer necessary. Do Shift A and do a color ramp. And we'll put this right here. Since we had used two values, 0.13 and 0.2, for the diffuse and the metallic, so they were slightly different, we can encode those here into the color ramp. So what we do, let's come over here and turn off rendering. We use the mask as an input for the factor here. And then we take the first, we've got these two little tabs that we can select, and I'm going to come to the lower one, and we're going to type in a value of 0.13, and then for the top one, we'll come down here, put in a value of 0.2, and then this gets driven into the roughness. So that when we click here, it's going to look pretty similar, but we now have the ability to control both of these independently. So for instance, if we come down, back down to this color ramp, and we come over to the value of 0.2, we can begin playing with that. And so that governs the roughness for the metal. So let's come back down here and return that back down to what we want. And then we could come down to this little tab, which governs the diffuse glossy, and we could play with it. So you see we could play with making it rougher or making it perfectly sharp, and we'll just return it back to the value that I like. So the point here is to show you that we gain simplicity in one area, but then we also gain complexity in another area, depending on the setup that you want for your material approach. So let's come in, and I've turned on the lights, and I'll just show you these. I'm using 4 area lights. So let's zoom out. In fact, I'm going to turn off the cameras to get rid of visual clutter. And you can see what I've done is I've just created these sort of long, oblong lights, and I just spent a little bit of time placing them in space and at a particular distance that I felt worked. And then I just played with some values that I felt worked. So that's all it came down to, right? So each of these, when we come over and look at it, you'll notice that the power of the light, this is an important tip, is distributed across the entire surface. So as this light gets bigger, the same amount of energy is leaving the entire surface. And so the entire surface is going to tend to look a little bit dimmer. So the power of your light is going to be governed by the distance of the light to the surface and also by its size. But in general, at this small scale, these power values are going to be pretty small. A value of, say, 5 watts would be very overpowering. That's an efficiency value. If you think of a 60-watt light bulb, most of that 60-watt light bulb of a traditional incandescent light, most of that energy is being lost as heat. And we're not talking about a heat loss value here. We're talking about the efficient component of the energy that's actually leaving as light. So that's why there's smaller values. So that's what that came down to, is me just playing with positions of lights and sizes until I got something that artistically looked good. So I hope you found this to be useful. to show you how you can do this dual layer approach, diffuse and metallic, on the same surface.